Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Infinite Podcast. I'm your host, and joining me today is the ever insightful Simon. Today we're diving into a hot pot here, political partisanship. What's really going on with it nowadays, huh? Whether it's social media shaking things up or recent events blurring those traditional lines we thought were clear-cut. Simon, let's get into this. How do you see technology affecting party alignments?
Oh, Joe, don't even get me started on technology and politics. It's like everyone has a megaphone now. Back in the day, you had to wait for the evening news or dig through papers to see what was up. Now, 2 seconds on Twitter, and boom, opinions everywhere. Everyone's pushing their agenda, left and right, literally. So yeah, I think it's totally reshaping how people align themselves, pulling folks in 10 different directions at once. What do you think?
Totally get that, Simon. But isn't there a flip side to everyone having a megaphone? Sure, it's chaotic with all these voices, but doesn't it also mean people are more informed, or at least have the tools to be? I mean, back then, wasn't it just a few gatekeepers deciding what we saw? Maybe now, despite the noise and confusion, folks have a shot to really shape their own views.
Uh, you got a point, Joe, but think about this. When everyone is shouting into the void, does anyone really get heard? Sure, we have access to more stuff, right? But it's all scattered. And here's the kicker. Just having info doesn't mean it's good info. Fact-checking is a hard game when your cousin's Facebook post looks just as legit as a major newspaper's article. It's chaos, man. People might end up more confused than informed. What do you make of that mess?
Yeah, you're hitting on a real mess there. It's like, how do you sift through all that noise? I wonder though, Simon, do you think it's maybe on us to get better at questioning what we read and see? Like, should we be teaching more critical thinking skills in schools or something to help manage this flood? What's your take on that solution?
Oh, for sure, Joe. Imagine a class at school dedicated to figuring out if your aunt's latest meme is legit or just another conspiracy about space lizards running the government. All right, kids, today we're going to learn why the moon landing definitely wasn't filmed in my uncle's backyard. We need those skills more than ever.
Ha, space lizards, love it. But yeah, seriously, that kind of education could be huge. Just think about it. Better discernment might lead to less polarization. People wouldn't be so quick to fall into these strictly bounded political camps if they knew how to check facts themselves. Maybe then, like, our political conversations wouldn't just be throwing memes and sound bites at each other. It could bring some actual nuance back into the game, don't you think?
Uh, yeah, nuance would be nice and all. But let's be real, Joe. Do you think folks actually want that? It's much easier to just pick a side and roll with it than to do the hard work of digging through details and challenging your own views. People love being right too much to get bogged down by nuances, don't you think? They're more about winning than understanding.
Yeah, Simon, that's a solid point. People do dig their heels in. Thing is, I think if we start mixing this critical thinking into education early on, like really hammer it home, it could shift that win or die mindset a bit. It's like planting seeds, right? Maybe not everyone catches on, but gradually, you kind of hope it leads to a crop of folks who are game for that heavy lifting, who see value in the gray areas instead of just picking black or white. So it might take a generation or two, but could be well worth the effort.
Yeah, I getcha. Planting seeds and all, right? But even with the long game in mind, we've got to wonder, are enough people going to buy into that? It's kind of like, trying to teach an old dog new tricks. Sounds great in theory, but real life, messy. Still, gotta admit, if it did work out like you're saying, Joe, that would be something else. Could genuinely shift how debates go down and maybe, just maybe, dial back some of that fierce partisanship. So, fingers crossed, huh?
Yeah, Simon, totally. It's like you're throwing a wild card in there, right? If folks actually start embracing that kind of thinking, it could really shake things up. The whole debate scene could get a refresh, less about slinging mud and more about, like, real discussions. And imagine, just maybe, we dial down the us versus them vibe a bit. That's kind of hopeful, huh? Makes you wonder what could kickstart this shift, though, don't you think? What might be the tipping point?
Yeah, for sure. What's the catalyst, right? What actually makes people finally say, all right, enough's enough, let's buckle down and do this thinking thing? Is it going to be like a big societal shakeup or maybe just technology getting even wilder? But, whenever we look for that tipping point, I'm just pondering here what stops us from sliding back to old ways when stuff gets tough? Because it usually does. Joe, what do you think keeps them steady in that new mindset?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Like, how do you make sure the new ways stick instead of just snapping back when the pressure's on? Maybe it's about building a culture around it, right? Not just throwing info at people and hoping it sticks, but kind of cultivating an environment where it's cool to be thoughtful and open, like making it part of the norm, not just something you do when it feels easy or convenient. And tech can play a role too, maybe by enhancing educational tools or creating platforms that reward deeper thinking over sound bites. I don't know, Simon, sounds tricky but kind of necessary, don't you think?
Yeah, nailing it right there. To add to that, if we peek back historically, partisanship isn't exactly new. Been around since like the early days of American politics. You had the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans going at it in the 1790s. But what's really wacky today is how this polarization has kind of seeped into everyday life, not just staying in the political arena. Technologically speaking, algorithms play a big role in what we see online, right? They keep feeding us the kind of content they think we'll eat up based on our past likes and views. That means you end up living in your own little echo chamber, hearing echoes of your thoughts bouncing back, which can really cement those partisan views without even crossing paths with opposing opinions. And here's a kicker. Studies suggest that Americans are more divided now than they've been in nearly any point in modern history. This division spikes up around election times, where you see folks literally cutting ties over political beliefs, all spurred on by what they consume on their feeds. It's wild, man. Makes you wonder if there's any turning back, or if we're just heading deeper into our corners. What's your take on coming out of those corners, Joe?
Yeah, it's like we're all in our own little boxing rings, isn't it? Just slugging at shadows and getting more and more worked up. But hey, imagine this wild scenario. What if there was a digital detox day where everyone, I mean everyone, just unplugs from social media at the same time? No feeds, no flames, just real life for 24 hours. Could that shake things up a bit? Throw us out of our corners for a sec? What do you think, Simon? Would people go for something like that, or am I just dreaming here?
Oh man, Joe, I'm just picturing the chaos now. People wandering around, kind of lost, remembering how to talk face to face again. Could be epic, like a massive game of real world tag. But seriously, that idea's got flair. Strip away the digital noise for a day? Might just remind folks there's more to life than arguing behind screens. Could nudge us closer together, or everyone ends up confused in the parking lot. Worth a shot, though, huh? What's the worst that could happen?
Yeah, the worst that could happen. Maybe everyone realizes they kind of miss arguing online. But let's swing into something a bit heavier, like think about times when crossing party lines actually did some good, you know? There's been moments in history, big ones, where folks from different political spectrums came together and it wasn't just fireworks. Like, take the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Massive deal, right? Needed support from both sides to get passed. It wasn't just one group pushing through. It was a real collaboration, though sure, there were political motives buzzing around. But at its core, it aimed for a societal benefit, really trying to tackle racial injustice head on. So what about now? You see any of that spirit today, or is it all just hunkering down in those ideological bunkers?
Yeah, Joe, you're spot on with that history dive. The Civil Rights Act? Huge. It's like when they actually team up across the aisle, monumental stuff can unfold. Kinda inspiring, right? But now? Feels like those days are dust. Seems everyone's just too scared to reach across unless there's a clear win for them. You think, maybe it's the fear of looking weak to their base, or is it something else keeping them from crossing lines these days? What's your feel on that, man?
Yeah, Simon, you're nailing the current mood. Fear's a big player. In today's fast-paced media environment, taking risks or stepping out of line gets you blasted instantly across multiple platforms. Now, thinking back to those classics, another major moment was the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013. Despite huge tensions and a government shutdown, this deal actually stemmed from heavy negotiations led by folks from both main parties. It wasn't perfect, but it avoided what could have been catastrophic in terms of financial fallout. And hey, don't forget something like the Clean Air Act amendments in 1990 under George W. Bush. Big environmental issues were tackled there thanks to cross-party support, aiming to improve air quality and combat acid rain. These events, they seem kind of out of reach right now with current party splits, huh? But maybe, just maybe, those old tales can spark some hope, or at least offer a lesson that intense divisions aren't permanent, not if there's a will to bridge them. What do you think? We got enough of that will lingering around these days.
Oh, for sure, Joe. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack, but sometimes that needle's just waiting to be found, right? Maybe we need a blockbuster crisis or something wild to get folks working together again. Or maybe it's simpler, like finding the right leaders who can channel some of that old school, let's do this together spirit. Either way, buddy, sounds like we need a bit more digging in those haystacks.
Yeah, Simon, digging in haystacks. That's one way to put it. But let's be real here. Do we really need a blockbuster crisis to push for change? Seems kinda extreme. I mean, shouldn't the daily struggles of folks be enough of a call to arms? Think about other times countries have banded together without the world needing to be on fire. After World War II, global powers, though divided on many fronts, came together to form things like the United Nations. It wasn't just about being reactive, it was proactive. It was planning for a less destructive future. So maybe what we really need is a shift in perspective. Focus on proactive collaboration rather than waiting for the roof to cave in. Leaders should definitely spark that spirit, but come on. Isn't that something voters should demand more consistently rather than scrambling when things hit rock bottom? What's your take on shifting that mindset before the crisis instead of after, Simon?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like waiting until your engine blows up to check the oil. Why not just keep it smooth from the start? Leaders and voters need to grab that maintenance manual and get to work before everything grinds to a halt. Proactivity could be our new cool trend, right? Let's not wait for apocalypse.
Yeah, diving deeper into that, Simon, it's like when you look at those instances of cross-party collaborations, a lot hinges on leadership willing to take the first step. Take, for instance, the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. Big deal under Clinton's administration, right? It actually saw Democrats and Republicans hammering out a plan to overhaul social welfare programs, despite their deep divides. It wasn't just about patching up immediate issues. It was an ambitious rethinking of policy, aiming for long-term benefits, reducing dependency while trying to keep a safety net intact. And inherently, there's risk in these moves. Leaders stepping out might face backlash from their base or media flames, yet they push because the potential societal payoff is big. So basically, it's not just about avoiding crisis mode, it's about building durable solutions together before things spiral. Seems a bit idealistic, maybe, but history shows us it's possible, man. That cool trend of proactivity, it's got roots, and maybe, just maybe, it's time to water them again, huh? What do you think, Simon? Can we bring back that spirit of '96, or is this all just wishful thinking?
Yeah, Joe, bringing back the spirit of '96, putting on that vintage flannel and cranking up the grunge. But seriously, it's not just a throwback we're after. It's about reigniting that will to genuinely collaborate. If they could do it then, with all those big disc players and dial-up internet, why not now with all our fancy tech? Let's get those leaders to tune back into that old school playlist, maybe pepper in some modern tracks, shake things up. What's next? They going vinyl or streaming, you think?
Yeah, Simon, cranking old school meets new wave. I like where you're headed. But here's the rub, man. Going vinyl or streaming? That's our big question. Seems leaders often choose the easy play playlist over deep tracks when it comes to handling real issues. But let's break it down with a rewind, like that decisive moment in '86, Immigration Reform and Control Act. Talk about cross-party collaboration. It flipped the script on how folks thought about immigration policies by imposing sanctions on employers and offering amnesty to many immigrants. It wasn't simple. Heck, it was downright controversial, but it got both sides at the table. Fast forward, we've got these tools, social media, instant communication, but does it actually bring us closer to solutions or just amplify the noise? Maybe the trick isn't choosing between vintage vinyl or streaming. Perhaps it's about how best to use the mix to create meaningful connections and get some solid governance flowing again. Like, seriously, can we harness our tech to boost transparency and foster dialogue instead of division? What's your vibe on that, Simon? Are we technologically enhanced enough to not just hear, but listen and act together?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like having a jukebox with all the hits but never hitting play. We've got the tech, we've got the tunes. Let's crank it up and see if we can actually dance together this time instead of stepping on each other's toes. What do you think? Are we ready to turn this political mosh pit into a dance-off?
Yes, Simon. The idea of actually syncing up and dancing together in this political landscape, it's kind of like imagining two politicians accidentally swapping their speeches at a debate. Can you picture it? One minute, you're all guns blazing about fiscal responsibility. Next thing you know, you're championing universal health care out of nowhere. Actually, let's riff on that for a sec. It'd be hilarious to think what would happen if, say, during a heated debate, our leaders realize they've been reading from the wrong script the whole time. What a plot twist, huh? Who do you think would fumble more trying to improve their way out?
Yeah, Joe, that's wild. Totally reminds me of this time. Listen to this. When I was at this big family dinner, right? Classic setup. Everyone has strong opinions, especially my Uncle Mike and Aunt Lisa, both on completely opposite sides politically. So we start talking politics, a terrible idea after two helpings of lasagna, and they both go off about their usual points. Midway, like completely out of the blue, my cousin switches their note cards on the table just for kicks. Total prankster, right? And man, you should have seen it. Uncle Mike starts defending environmental regulations, and Aunt Lisa is all about cutting taxes, and the whole table goes silent. Took them a good 5 minutes to realize. The looks on their faces? Priceless. But dude, it kind of makes you think how tied we get to our scripts, huh? Imagine politicians doing that, not even noticing because maybe, just maybe, those ideas aren't as black and white as they claim. What a scene that would be, right?
Yeah, Simon. That's a riot with your family. Classic. But it's wild, right? Like imagine on the big stage during a televised debate. One minute you're in your eco-warrior costume. Next thing, bam, tax-slashing superhero. The audience would be losing it. But seriously, it's wild because those miscues show how things aren't always set in stone. You mentioned Uncle Mike and Aunt Lisa. They rolled with their new policies for a bit without even blinking. Makes you wonder, are some of these political personas just rehearsed lines? What happens when they have to, oh, I don't know, actually think on their feet? It brings up a funny but kind of serious point about authenticity, huh? How much of this is performance versus genuine belief? Maybe we need more moments like that. Not necessarily pranks, but real tests to push our leaders out of their comfort zones. See who can dance without tripping over their own script. What do you think, Simon? Are most politicians just playing parts till someone pulls the curtain?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like everyone's wearing a mask until someone trips over the stage wire. Suddenly, it's improv time. Do you stick to your character, or do you wing it and reveal what you actually stand for? Maybe we should toss all their scripts and see who really knows their stuff and who's just been mimicking lines this whole time.
Yeah, tossing scripts sounds like a solid plan to me. Imagine those debate stages turning into freestyle rap battles. No prep, just raw policy pitches straight from the dome. Would definitely crank up the authenticity, wouldn't it? Who do you think would actually nail it and who'd crash and burn, Simon?
Oh, for sure, Joe. Let's talk real quick about some classic switcheroos before we dive into who'd own the stage. Like, remember when Donald Trump, originally a Democrat and Reform Party member, swung to become a Republican? There's a flip-flop that had folks spinning. And hey, Ronald Reagan was once a Democrat too before becoming a conservative icon. Or how about more recently with Bernie Sanders, always aligning with Democrats, but sticks firmly to his independent label, kind of like refusing to pick a team in dodgeball, but playing every game. Then there's Hillary Clinton, started as a Republican supporting Goldwater, then hopped over to Camp Democrat faster than you can say election year. Seriously, if debates were freestyle rap battles, it would be endless entertainment seeing who's quick on their feet or who trips over them. Imagine someone suddenly defending the opposite side without missing a beat. Now that would show some real chops, or just total chaos. Who do you think could pull it off, Joe?
Simon, while tossing everyone into a freestyle showdown sounds like a blast and all for revealing true colors, there's something to be said about flipping sides showing flexibility rather than confusion. Like, take Reagan or Trump switching up their party affiliations. It's not always flaky. Sometimes it's about evolving ideologies. People grow, right? Their ideas change as they're exposed to new info or different life experiences. So maybe these switches aren't just about political convenience, but genuine shifts in thinking. If debates kind of pressed on these evolutions instead of only catching people off guard, we might get deeper insights into why these changes happen, not just who's quick with a comeback. That might actually tell us more about their capabilities to lead and adapt in the real world, you know? What's your vibe on that? Seeing flip-flops as evolution instead of inconsistency?
Oh, for sure, Joe. You've got a point. Maybe those flips aren't just for show. They could really be about growth, adapting to new truths, like shedding old skin and all that. It's kind of refreshing to think of it as evolving instead of just playing the game. Makes you wonder how many other flips are out there that we just brushed off as political theater. What's the real story behind the switch? More digging on our end, maybe, huh?
Hey Simon, diving into this, do you think we're heading toward a political smoothie, blending all ideas into one, or are we just chopping everything into finer bits? It's like deciding between a buffet and a fusion dish.
Yeah, Joe. That's a solid question. Honestly, it kind of feels like we're leaning more towards the buffet style. Everyone grabbing a bit of this and a little of that, you know? People are so diverse and their beliefs kind of fly all over the map. But here's the kicker. While it seems cool to have options, does it not also get, like, super chaotic? All these niche groups popping up could make us more divided. We've got more flavors than ever. But maybe what we really need is to find some common ground instead of just filling our plates with whatever caters to our current craving. I mean, think about voting behavior. With everything so scattered, trying to pull together a unified campaign strategy becomes this almost impossible puzzle. And don't get me started on public trust. How can you trust a kitchen that's always changing up the menu? So, yeah, maybe the challenge isn't just embracing diversity in thought, but also steering a bit towards that fusion dish where bits and pieces contribute to something coherent. Wouldn't it be dope if we could have constructive dialogues without bickering over whose ingredient tastes better? What's your take, Joe? Buffet chaos or fusion order?
Yeah, Simon, you're hitting the nail on the head there. The whole buffet approach does feel more like what we're seeing now, with a raw spread of all sorts of ideas, loads of variety, but you gotta wonder at what cost. But fusion, man, that's an interesting recipe. Taking bits from everywhere to make something new and maybe even tastier. That's a cool vision. But it's tricky, right? Like blending without turning everything into mush. About that public trust thing you mentioned. How do we build that back when everyone's pulling in different directions? Do you think there's a way to, like, cook up a strategy that acknowledges the mess but steers us towards some common flavor that works for most?
Totally, Joe. So, like, when it comes to building that public trust, right? I think honesty's key, being real about the mess we're in, but also showing a clear recipe for how we mix up these different flavors into something that's not only palatable, but actually good. And, like, it's not just about preaching unity or mixing for the sake of mixing. It's got to be about finding those core values that resonate across the board and using those as the base, kind of like the flour in a cake. Then, yeah, sprinkle in the diverse viewpoints where they boost the flavor. This approach could genuinely help decrease that choppy division, offering a more unified vision without diluting distinct voices. Campaigns would still need to be sharp on their feet, pivoting strategies to both represent their base and also swing to the center enough to appeal across aisles. So, yeah, steering towards a commonly appreciated dish, acknowledging diversities, but highlighting shared delicious bits might just be the trick. What do you think, man? Is there a common ingredient we're all craving, or are we too spread out in our culinary tastes?
Yeah, Simon, finding that common ingredient, it's like hunting for the secret spice everyone forgot about but actually loves. Makes you wonder if what we're really craving is more trust and less drama in the kitchen, right? What's that magic seasoning that'll bring everyone to the table happily?
Well, Joe, that's a sweet thought, finding that magic seasoning. But let's be real. Maybe the thing is, not everyone wants to sit at the same table. Some folks might genuinely prefer their own distinct flavors over a blended mishmash. And hey, that's not necessarily all bad. Like, think about it. Having a bunch of unique groups can drive some serious innovation and passion in politics. When everyone's thrown into the same pot, you risk watering down those strong beliefs that push for specific changes, which are often needed. Diverse political landscapes mean people get represented in more authentic ways, reflecting genuine differences in society. And like, while it sounds chaotic, this diversity can actually enhance democracy by making sure no single viewpoint becomes too dominant. It keeps things lively and ensures debates keep evolving instead of just circling around the middle ground. So yeah, while unity is cool and all, there's something to be said for keeping our individual kitchens cooking up what they believe in. It keeps the whole culinary scene dynamic and responsive. What do you reckon, Joe? Are we maybe overlooking the perks of having a varied menu?
Simon, that's a spicy take. Reveling in diversity might just be the key ingredient to keeping our political landscape zesty and flavorful. Makes you think, maybe it's not about blending into blandness, but celebrating those strong, distinct tastes.
Oh, absolutely, Joe. Like, while celebrating diversity sounds awesome and all, a full-on feast of opinions, it's not without its mess, right? I mean, let's be real. If every plate is super different, it gets tough figuring out which dish to actually dig into when everyone's sitting at the same table. But here's a twist. What if instead of just accepting this buffet as is, we start crafting menus that highlight these distinct flavors while slowly introducing elements that tie them together? Huh? Kind of like those fusion restaurants that take a bit from here and a dash from there to make something totally new but still recognizable. Like, imagine political parties doing more than just sticking firmly in their corners. They could adopt bits of others' policies that work, adapting them into their platform without losing their core identity. Could keep things vibrant yet cohesive, enhancing collaboration without forcing a dull blend. It's about striking that balance, maintaining integrity while being open to mixing things up. What do you think, Joe? Could that spice up our political landscape, or are we just stirring up a recipe for confusion?
Yeah, Simon, mixing up the menu like that? That's some food for thought. Could turn the usual political grind into a more creative cook-off. Keeping the identity but tossing in new flavors could seriously whip up something everyone can get a taste of. Worth a shot, right?
Yeah, Joe. And speaking of mixing it up and shaking things a bit, what about those political independents? They're like the food critics of our political restaurant, not really pledging loyalty to one chef or another. They're kind of stirring the pot in their own way, don't you think? What's your take on who these folks really are and why they choose to stay independent rather than picking a side?
Yeah, Simon, independents, they're an intriguing bunch. Okay, so statistically, folks are classed as independents when they don't officially register or identify with any major political party, right? They like to keep their options open and often swing between candidates based on issues rather than party lines. Diving into the demographics, you've got a wide range of ages, but many younger voters, especially millennials and Gen Z, are leaning towards independence. They feel disenfranchised by traditional party politics and more driven by issues like climate change, social justice, the pressing stuff. Education-wise, it's mixed, but there's a decent chunk that holds at least a bachelor's degree, suggesting some level of informed decision-making in their independent status. Plus, geographically, you find them spread out, but there are significant numbers in suburban and urban areas, places where diversity of thought and lifestyle might influence less rigid political alignments. Their motivation? It's mainly about dissatisfaction with the existing parties, feeling that neither really covers all their values or concerns. They crave flexibility instead of being tied down by traditional party agendas, which increasingly feel out of touch with the fast-changing societal demands. It's this hunger for real-time relevance in politics that keeps them from picking a permanent side, I reckon.
Oh man, Joe, that's spot on. This whole mix of independence shaking things up is like those mystery ingredient cooking shows. Everybody's guessing what they're going to throw in next. Keeps the big parties on their toes, wondering if these independents are about to hand them a secret sauce or just toss in something totally unexpected. Adds a whole new layer of excitement to the political cook-off, don't you think?
Absolutely, Simon. It's like every election cycle is a new season of the show. Makes you wonder who's going to surprise us next with their wild card moves.
Yeah, Joe, it's totally like waiting for the next plot twist in our favorite drama series. And these independents, they're not just spectators. They're actively shaping the storyline with their, unpredictable choices. So, considering how these wild card moves keep things lively, do you think this could lead more people to identify as independents? Like, could this trend of shaking up the traditional political playbook become even bigger in the upcoming elections? What's your take on this, Joe?
Uh, well, Simon, while the rise of independence does add a thrill to the whole electoral process, there's like another side to consider. See, even with the excitement around not conforming to traditional party lines, many voters might stick to those major parties because they offer a sense of clarity and structure, something like a familiar recipe. Here's some food for thought. Despite the allure of being independent, historical patterns often show that when push comes to shove, people tend to fall back on the established parties. Why? Because these parties are typically seen as more impactful in driving substantive policy changes, having the numbers and strategic positioning in legislatures to actually implement their agendas. There's this feeling of voting power being wasted on third candidates or independents due to things like the winner-takes-all system, which kind of discourages stepping out of the traditional party framework during significant elections. So yeah, the mix is definitely getting spicier with more independents stirring the pot. Still, the pull towards the familiar, the established parties is strong, given the perceived effectiveness and resources they bring. In upcoming elections, people weighing these factors might opt to stick with what feels more substantial and proven, rather than rolling the dice on an independent wild card.
Yeah, Joe, diving a bit deeper into the world of independence, it's pretty fascinating. Did you know, according to surveys, a lot of independents actually lean toward one party or another, but still refuse to fully commit? They're commonly called leaners. This means while they identify as independents, in crunch times, like major elections, they tend to swing back to their leaning side, adding an extra layer of unpredictability to predicting election results. Another cool tidbit is that independents are not a homogenous group. They vary greatly in their political views, ranging from very conservative to very liberal, which makes them a wildly diverse crowd. This diversity can lead to some unique alliances and voting patterns, disrupting traditional two-party dynamics. Plus, historically, despite their increasing numbers, fewer than 10% of independents are what you might call true independents. That is, those who really don't lean towards any party at all. These folks are the real wild cards because their vote can truly go any way, making them highly sought after in tight races. So, while they're a tough group to pin down, understanding the nuances of these independents, a mix of leaners, true neutrals, and everything in between, could seriously spice up how campaigns target voters. Cool stuff, right, Joe? What do you reckon about the strategic games parties might play to woo these unpredictable independents?
Absolutely, Simon. It's like every independent voter is a mini puzzle that campaigns are scrambling to solve. The strategic game here becomes a super intense episode of Clue, trying to figure out which issues will sway these diverse leaners. Grabbing their attention could totally flip the election board.
Totally, Joe. It's like every election year is just a giant game of political Jenga. One wrong move with the independents and the whole tower could come crashing down.
You're right, Simon. That game of Jenga metaphor really hits the nail on the head. Speaking of which, when we look back historically, the role independents play has sometimes literally tipped those blocks, impacting election outcomes in major ways.
Uh, Absolutely, Joe. So, like, if we roll back the clock, there are a bunch of standout moments where independents really scrambled the usual election playbook. Take the 1992 presidential election, for instance. Ross Perot, running as an independent, snagged a whopping 19% of the vote. Huge, right? His campaign kind of highlighted voter dissatisfaction with the two major parties and showed that a significant chunk of Americans were ready to step away from traditional choices. This whole Perot phenomenon shined a light on what independents could do, especially when they rally behind someone who truly seems different from the standard offerings. And this isn't just about one memorable election. Shifts over time show these voters growing more influential, reflecting wider changes in political attitudes or societal values. Well, at least that's how I see it unpacking historically. What about you, Joe?
Yeah, Simon, the Perot example is a classic, totally reshaped how we view independents and their punch in the ballot box. But if we flip the script a bit, while he did snag a hefty chunk of the vote, some argue that his run maybe didn't as directly change the final outcome as often touted. Analyzing voter trends, it's like, well, those who lean towards Perot were equally disenchanted with both major parties, suggesting they might have skipped voting altogether if he hadn't been in the race. So the real twist is figuring out whether independents are just adding spice by being present, or if they actually shift the election flavor entirely. Tracking these nuances over various elections helps decode that mystery, but it's never black and white, always some shade of gray, you know? And with more folks claiming independent status in recent years, this wildcard factor only seems to be growing, shaking up traditional party strategies even more. What do you think? Are these shifts making parties rethink their game plans more aggressively now?
Yeah, Joe, dude, this whole shift you're talking about, it's really turning things on their head, huh? Like, it gets me thinking. Are parties now more like those panicked cooks in a timed cooking challenge, tossing things together hoping something sticks because of these unpredictable independents? And what really hits me is how this not only shakes up every single recipe, campaign strategy, but also pushes both major parties to either genuinely address wider concerns or just get way better at appearing to do so, right? It's kind of wild. Makes you feel like the power dynamics in politics are always in some sort of flux, influenced by this growing group of voters who don't want to play by the traditional rules. So it's definitely not just adding spice. It feels like independents force the entire kitchen to rethink their recipes. What's your take, Joe? How are you seeing this play out from your side?
Totally, Simon. It's like independents are the sous chefs who haven't been to culinary school but cook up a storm at home. They're forcing the professional chefs, the major parties, to either step up their game or risk losing the crowd. So yeah, these independents might just be rewriting the recipe book on how political battles are fought and won. Wild times, huh?
Wild times indeed, Joe. It's like every election is now an episode of a reality cooking show where the surprise ingredient always comes from the independents. Keeps everyone on their toes.
Exactly, Simon. And going back to adding context here, like, think about how these independents historically shifted not just election outcomes, but also policy discussions. They're like those surprise ingredients that aren't just there for shock value, but actually influence what ends up on the menu. The thing is, this kind of voting pattern adds pressure on both major parties to adapt or rethink their strategies, serving more like what the people, eaters, really want. It's a dynamic buffet, man.
Yeah, Joe, it's definitely like you said, a dynamic buffet. But, uh, here's a twist, man. While independents do shake things up by pushing new issues and perspectives into the limelight, sometimes I wonder if they really manage to alter the core menu, that is, the major policy frameworks, or whether they just season the discussion a bit without changing the main dish. Like, sure, their presence forces debates on varied issues, but when it comes down to actual policy making, those in power, the established parties, still hold the big guns. So, are we looking at real influence or just like an illusion of impact? That's something to chew on, because marking a ballot for an independent could feel empowering, yet the follow through in terms of substantial policy shift might still be dictated by the bigger players. What's your angle on this, Joe? How substantial do you think their impact really is beyond the voting booth?
That's a super legit point, Simon. So, like, while independents definitely mix things up at the polls and in public debates, the real nitty gritty of policymaking often still sits with those holding majority power, your big party players. It's like independents can spotlight issues, right? But pushing them from talking points to actual laws is another game. Historically, we see moments where independents sway the legislative direction briefly or introduce new ideas that get absorbed into the mainstream agendas of larger parties, which kind of dilutes the independent impact over time. The true independents, those not leaning either way, are kind of rare gems, making it even harder for a solid, cohesive push on policies without some backing from bigger parties. So, yeah, their influence might be more about stirring discussion than steering the ship. What do you think? Does that blend with how you see it play out?
Joe, that's spot on. It's like independents are those mystery flavor chips. Everyone's excited to try them, but whether they become a new favorite or just a one time oddity depends on how the flavor actually mixes with the classics. It spices up the snack rack, but doesn't necessarily change everyone's go to chip choice. What else are we missing in this mix, man?
Absolutely, Simon. They're indeed like those mystery flavor chips, shaking things up but not always changing core tastes. As we keep eyeing these patterns, it's fascinating to think about what future roles independents could play as public sentiments shift and new issues emerge. Maybe that's the next big crunch we need to chew on. How much will they shape the menu in, say, the next decade? What do you think?
For sure, Joe. As we dive into the future impact of independence, it's kind of hilarious to think about all those weird myths and stereotypes surrounding them, right? Like, there's this funny idea that all independents are massively undecided, perpetually wavering on a fence somewhere between two colossal political yards. Have you come across any wild stereotypes or misunderstandings about independence in your conversations?
Oh, totally, Simon. It's like another one I've heard is that all independents are these radical centrists, as if they have this magical ability to perfectly balance all political viewpoints, kind of like a tightrope walker in a circus. It's silly because, well, being independent doesn't mean you're smack dab in the middle on every issue. Some lean left, some lean right, and others might just be focused on specific issues altogether without caring much about where they fall on the traditional spectrum. Uh, it's a way more colorful mix than people assume, huh? What's another funny stereotype you've run into?
Oh, right. And here's a funny one, Joe. There's this stereotype that all independents are like political unicorns or something, rare and mythical creatures who barely exist in reality. I mean, come on, they make up a pretty sizable chunk of the electorate. But the funniest part is the belief that independents just throw their votes into void, as if they're kind of tossing them into a black hole where they won't really affect the outcome. As we've talked about before, they can be major game changers in elections. It's wild how varied these perceptions are, right? What's your take on that, Joe?
Oh, yeah, Simon, the vote into the void stereotype is hilariously off base. Factually, independents have swayed plenty of tight races historically. Like, look at the 2000 presidential election. Some argue that voters for Nader, who ran as an independent, influenced the narrow margins in key states. And about this political unicorn myth, data from Gallup consistently shows that a good chunk of the U.S. electorate identifies as independents, often outpacing those who identify strictly with one of the two major parties. This idea they're some rare breed is just comical when you look at the numbers. They're not mythical creatures, they're a significant and growing group, making these stereotypes seem even more absurd. How do people still hang on to these old views?
Man, Joe, it's like if Bigfoot came out in a business suit saying he's just like us, trying to get by without picking sides. People are clinging to these old views like a raccoon on last week's garbage. Just can't let go.
Yeah, Simon, and sticking to that Bigfoot analogy, it's like everyone thinks independents are hiding out, trying to be mysterious on purpose. But in reality, many are just folks disenchanted with the usual party lines or tired of the, constant partisan push and pull. They're more about issues than labels, which kind of busts another myth that they're non-committal or wishy-washy. They often have very strong convictions. They just don't always align neatly on the traditional left-right spectrum. It's funny how these stereotypes completely miss the mark, creating a sort of comedic caricature of what it actually means to be independent. It shows there's still a lot of room to educate and clarify what this growing voter group truly represents, right?
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And it's like people sometimes paint them as these high-minded idealists, right? The stereotype that independents are up in an ivory tower looking down on the messy party politics. It just cracks me up. Like, not everyone who decides to step away from the two-party system is trying to be some philosopher king of voters. And let's not forget the funny idea that all independents must be super secretive, handling their ballots like some top secret CIA document. No. Many are pretty vocal and passionate about where they stand on issues. They're just not waving a party flag while they do it. I think you're spot on. There's this huge need to break down these stereotypes and really talk about what being independent means today. It's way more normal than people make it out to be. What's another misconception that ticks you off, Joe?
Yeah, Simon, that whole secretive voter image is just out of left field. One misconception that really gets me is that independents are all over the place, like they can't make up their minds from one election to the next, as if they're just randomly picking candidates without thought or, a consistent set of principles. But many independents actually do a ton of research and deeply consider their choices because they aren't tied down by party loyalty. They're often some of the most informed voters out there. There's a lot of thoughtful decision-making going on, contrary to the flaky voter stereotype. It kind of makes you wonder, why don't these truths get as much attention as the stereotypes, right? What do you think keeps this skewed narrative going?
Right, Joe? It's almost like there's a conspiracy to keep the mismatched socks stereotype alive because it's just more entertaining to imagine these dramatically indecisive characters at the polls. I mean, if people realize just how rational and informed many independents are, it might just be too normal for the spicy news cycle. What's the craziest thing you've heard someone assume about independence, Joe?
For sure, Simon. Probably the wildest thing I've heard is that independents are these alien observers of Earth politics, trying to not interfere, completely off the wall. It underscores how folks love sticking to more bizarre tales rather than understanding the straightforward reality of independent voters. There's so much more under this hood to unpack and laugh about. What other out there myths have you come across?
Oh man, Joe, talking about these out there myths and the actual potential of independence, it kind of leads us into pondering what politics might look like as their influence keeps growing. Like thinking about future elections, do you reckon we'll see campaign strategies really start to shift to reel in that independent vote more effectively?
Honestly, Simon, I'm a bit skeptical about how quick those changes will actually hit campaign strategies. Even with polling numbers showing independents growing in influence, the big parties often seem pretty stuck in their ways, right? They might throw in some broad-reaching promises here and there, trying to snag a few independent votes, but fundamentally changing tactics to truly address this diverse group's concerns, that'll take some serious shifts in thinking. And another thing, getting that right isn't just about winning votes, it reshapes what accountability looks like in governance, pulling it away from strict partisan lines. Imagine politicians having to cater to a real mixed bag of voter needs rather than just their base. It would change the whole game. What do you think it'll take for them to really start pivoting?
Joe, it's like might take a bit of a wake-up call for these big political parties to finally pivot. They need to see that slapping on a one-size-fits-all approach just isn't cutting it anymore, with independence on the rise. There's such a mixed group with varied interests and concerns, right? And beyond just trying to hook independence with catchy slogans or broad promises, there's got to be a more genuine engagement on diverse issues. Like, think strategies tailored to local concerns or specific policies rather than massive sweeping statements. That kind of shift could really bring about some compelling changes in how campaigns run and even perhaps break up the standard red versus blue tug of war we're so used to seeing. So I guess what it'll take is real evidence that catering wide isn't as rewarding as going deep on the real meaty issues that matter to everyone, especially those who don't feel at home in the established parties. Does that kind of change seem realistic anytime soon, Joe? Or are we looking at a slow burn?
Simon, it feels like a slow burn, but shifts can surprise us, especially when a tipping point hits. The real drama starts when a major election gets flipped unexpectedly by independents who demand more than just the usual lip service. That's the kind of wake-up call that could really fast-track those changes. What do you think would be the first big sign that a shift is truly underway?
Oh, the first big sign? Uh, Picture this, Joe. Imagine a couple of key swing states turning a shade we don't even have a name for yet, thanks to the independents. That'd send everyone scrambling to rethink their playbooks.
Absolutely, Simon. When those swing states start coloring outside the usual red and blue lines, that'll be a serious game changer. It'll make every strategist's head spin trying to pin down what independents really want. And let's not forget the media frenzy that would follow. Could you imagine the headlines? But think about this. Beyond just swaying elections, if independents keep gaining traction, do you think we could see them forming their own solid movement or party? Like one strong enough to stand toe-to-toe with the big guys?
Uh, Joe, while that idea of independents rallying together into a major movement or party sounds like it could shake things up, I'm kind of doubtful about whether that's the way things will pan out. See, the whole strength and appeal of being an independent often lies in not being tightly bound to a specific group or set of policies. And remember how varied independents are. They range from those slightly left of center to ones leaning a bit right. And then you've got folks who are just fed up with the whole system. Trying to unify such a wildly diverse crowd under one banner, that'd be like, trying to herd cats. Maybe more realistic is seeing them continue influencing policies and elections from the sidelines without forming a traditional structure. It keeps their flexibility intact, which is pretty central to their identity. What's your take on that possibility, Joe?
Yeah, Simon, that's a solid point. It reminds me of this time. I chatted with a diner owner down in a swing district, really eclectic place, full of folks from all walks. The owner, let's call him Mike, he used to vote solidly for one party, but grew kind of disillusioned and started swinging independent. What struck me was how he navigated his customers' diverse political views. He never pinned his colors to the mast. Instead, he focused on what mattered locally, creating a neutral space where everyone felt welcome. He really impacted local issues through small-scale, direct actions rather than aligning with broad national movements. And you see, Simon, that tangible impact, very local and functional, sort of mirrors your view of independence influencing things without needing a formal structure. So maybe the future isn't about big, dramatic shifts or new parties forming. Perhaps it's more about these micro-influences spreading out and driving change in understated yet profoundly effective ways. It's less flashy, sure, but like Mike, it might just be what actually works. What do you think about looking at influence from this kind of grassroots level?
Man, Joe, that grassroots angle is genius. It's like quietly planting seeds in a garden and watching as they slowly take over the landscape. So subtle, yet potentially revolutionary.
Absolutely, Simon. That grassroots analogy is spot on. Speaking of influence and subtlety, it kind of naturally leads us into another interesting terrain: swing states. These guys are political chameleons, changing election outcomes as they shift their colors. So, what really makes a state a swing state? Isn't that fascinating to explore?
Oh, absolutely, Joe. Uh, you dive into what makes a swing state, and it's like they've got split personalities, right? It's not just about being politically undecided or split down the middle. It's deeper, man. These states can lean one way in one election and do a total 180 by the next. It's all about that blend, a near even mix of folks who vote red or blue, which creates this perfect storm where either major party could snag a win. And think about the impact. Campaigns literally throw their kitchen sinks, budgets, strategies, big time rallies into these areas because snagging a swing state can mean winning the whole enchilada. Yet it feels kind of cyclic, don't you think? Pumping resources, making promises, then poof, onto the next cycle. Adjustments feel superficial sometimes, you know? Like, are we stuck on replay here, Joe?
Oh, for sure, Simon. The dynamics are intense. Historically, swing states like Florida, Ohio, and Pennsylvania have shown they can really go either way. Example: look at Ohio. Voted Republican from 1968 to 1980, swung to Democrats in 1992 and 1996, then back to the GOP in recent elections. Each shift comes from a finely balanced electorate sensitive to national issues, local economic conditions, and candidate appeal. Here's another layer. Demographics are changing constantly. As populations evolve, so do political leanings. Take Nevada or Arizona, traditionally red but now more purple due to growing urban and Hispanic populations influencing the vote. You hit it, though, on campaigns reacting to these shifts. It's all about the optics and immediate gains. Investing heavily in ads, rallies, ground campaigns, each cycle is a sprint to win over those critical few percentage points that could tilt the balance. It exposes this continuous loop pattern you're talking about, endlessly targeting short-term victories without necessarily fostering long-term alignments. Makes you wonder if the real work starts or ends at winning the state.
Totally, Joe. It's like playing a high stakes game of musical chairs, except the music never really stops, and the chairs keep moving. Makes you wonder, are we focusing too much on the game and not enough on why we're playing in the first place?
Yeah, Simon, it's a relentless game. And diving into that, we see the profound impact these swing states have beyond just the immediate election cycle. Historically, campaigning tactics in these battleground areas have led to some significant policy shifts and political realignments. Like, remember how the Midwest swung heavily for one party in 2016 after feeling neglected by the current trade and economic policies? That movement was pivotal, emphasizing the deep connection between voter sentiment in swing states and broader national policy directions. But here's another interesting twist. The attention those states get affects voter engagement significantly. States recognized as battlegrounds often see higher voter turnout because of the increased campaign focus, rallies, and ads, all pushing residents to participate more actively in the electoral process. It's like being told constantly that your vote could tilt the scale, which not only heightens the stakes but also boosts civic involvement. So while we might question if it's all a high-stakes game, this heightened engagement bears its own kind of fruit, rallying communities to weigh in on critical national dialogues. So yeah, swing states aren't just chess pieces. They reshape many aspects of our democratic engagement, don't you think?
Definitely, Joe. It's like every vote there is a magic bean growing into this gigantic stalk in the political landscape. Makes you wonder, how much does it twist and turn the bigger picture over time, huh?
Yeah, Simon. That twisting and turning in the bigger picture is like watching a slow-motion chess game. Each move by these swing states can skew not just one election, but potentially set trends for future policies. But let's poke at this a bit. Sometimes, don't you think focusing intensely on these swing states might distort national campaigns? Like, they zero in so much on issues dominant in a few key areas that broader national concerns get sidelined. Imagine candidates overplaying themes more relevant to swing state demographics, which can differ markedly from those of solidly red or blue states. For instance, focusing heavily on industrial manufacturing issues in the Rust Belt, while perhaps under-discussing tech growth or environmental priorities significant elsewhere. This skewed focus could tilt national policy discussions unfairly, don't you feel? Moreover, the heavyweight attention on swing states, all the rallies, ad spends, and strategic promises, it's kind of creating an uneven playing field in presidential runs, huh? Some voters get a roller coaster of political engagement and promises, while others in non-swing states might feel their vote doesn't carry as much weight. Doesn't this risk a type of voter apathy outside the battlegrounds?
Oh, totally, Joe. It's like we've got VIP tickets to a concert only in those swing states, while other places get the echo from outside the venue. Makes you question if everyone's really at the same show, right?
Absolutely, Simon. This disparity, some getting the VIP treatment and others just echoes, it's like not all voices are valued equally, you know? It creates a sort of imbalance in how people perceive their role in our democracy. Makes me wonder, do you think this could eventually lead to major changes in how campaigns are run? Like perhaps pushing for a more unified approach that addresses national concerns rather than focusing narrowly on swing state issues?
Yeah, totally. This major emphasis on swing states, it's kind of like only watering part of your garden, right? The rest starts to feel neglected. And before you know it, voter engagement in those overlooked areas might just wither away. So, by focusing solely on these critical zones, we're potentially missing out on fuller, more inclusive policy discussions that resonate across the board. And, like, if this pattern keeps up, there could be a push, maybe even a need, for broader campaign reforms. Imagine campaigns that have to address issues globally across states rather than pinpointing. This could lead to not just more equitable voter engagement, but also policies that are more reflective of the national sentiment rather than the swing state mood of the moment. So, by focusing too narrowly, we risk skewing both perceptions and policies, which isn't great for anyone, really. It's something candidates and strategists might want to seriously think about adjusting.
Absolutely, Simon. Diving deeper into the fabric of swing states and how they shape elections brings up some critical nuggets of history and political strategy. So let's unpack a few more layers. Historically, the concept of swing states has evolved alongside shifts in political alliances and demographic changes. For instance, after World War II, states like California were largely conservative but shifted to a more liberal stance by the 1990s due to demographic changes, including immigration patterns. Economically, swing states often represent a microcosm of the broader national economy, but are unique in having varied industries that might be more sensitive to certain policies or economic upheavals. Think auto manufacturing in Michigan or oil and gas in Pennsylvania. This variance makes their electoral leanings particularly sensitive to current economic climates and policy proposals. Furthermore, there's also the influence of local media landscapes that play a significant role in shaping voter opinions in these states. Regional news can often have different focuses, highlighting specific issues or candidate qualities that national news might overlook. This tailored information flow can sway voters differently than in more homogeneously partisan states. Thus, both parties spending disproportionately to court these undecided or flexible voter pools isn't just strategy, it's necessity, driven by the understanding that these states reflect nuanced, shifting arrays of political, economic, and social crosscurrents that could dictate national governance. So when you look at it this way, the complexity of focusing campaigns in these regions is not only about winning votes, but also navigating a nuanced socio-political landscape that swings more than just during election cycles.
Whoa, talk about walking a tightrope in high winds. It's like each swing state is a different circus act, and the candidates have to be these jack of all trades performers. Makes you wonder if anyone ever nails the routine perfectly, huh?
Exactly, Simon. It's nearly impossible to nail perfectly with so many variables at play. Every election feels like a cliffhanger in those states. Speaking of tight elections, remember Florida back in 2000? Just a handful of votes there basically decided the entire presidency. Wild how small margins in just one swing state can tip the scales, huh? What do you think were some pivotal factors in that scenario?
Oh man, Florida 2000 was like if every American election got together and decided to throw a mystery party. Nobody knew who was wearing the president mask until the very end. And the main attraction? Hanging Chads. Who knew tiny bits of paper could have so much power, right? It's like voting meets confetti making. Absolute chaos in paradise.
Exactly, Simon. Hanging Chads turned that election into a full-on detective story. It's mind-blowing to think about how something so small as a Chad, just a flimsy piece of paper, could hold so much weight in the fate of the country. It really puts perspective on this idea that every single vote counts. You can just picture all these officials squinting at ballots, trying to figure out voter intent. It's craziness, pure craziness.
Yeah, Joe. It's like every vote is not just a whisper, but a potential shout in the outcome of an election. And besides the whole hanging Chad debacle, you've got issues like voter turnout, media influence, and last-minute campaigning that can totally shake things up. Like, remember how close the polls were versus the actual results? It kind of shows you that public opinion can be shaky. It's all about who actually shows up to cast their ballot.
Uh, you're hitting a crucial point there, Simon. The whole notion of polls versus actual turnout. It's like polls give us a snapshot, but they can't always capture the full dynamic, especially in those final days when campaigns are pushing hard and folks are making their last-minute decisions. It shows how unpredictable things get when it comes down to the wire. But let's not forget about other memorable moments, like Ohio in 2004. Polls showed a super tight race between Bush and Kerry, and the state literally decided the presidency with its 20 electoral votes. Voter mobilization efforts by both parties were off the charts because they knew it could go either way. And even though polls had them neck and neck, Bush managed a slight edge that clinched his re-election. Makes you think about the power of ground game in these swing states, right?
Absolutely, Joe. That Ohio clash was like the last 5 minutes of a thriller movie, edge of your seat kind of stuff. The ground game you mentioned was crucial. Both sides were essentially laying down a siege on Ohio, phones ringing off the hook, canvassers knocking on every door, and advertisements flooding every possible medium. Now think about Pennsylvania in 2016, another turntable moment. The state had gone Democratic in presidential elections since 1992. Yet, Trump flipped it with a narrow victory, mainly by appealing to working-class voters and capitalizing on discontent about trade policies and manufacturing job losses. It was strategic targeting at its best, exploiting real local concerns that perhaps were underappreciated in national discourse. These iconic moments aren't just about politics. They're studies in psychology, sociology, and even geography. Swing states reflect the volatile mix of diverse interests. How parties play into or against these interests can literally change historical trajectories.
Yeah, those are powerful examples, Simon, but let's play devil's advocate for a second here. While strategic targeting and the ground game obviously play a huge role, focusing solely on swing states could potentially lead to overlooking broader national interests. Like when candidates pivot their policies just to appeal to voters in these key areas, it might alienate others across the nation whose voices are equally important but get less attention. And thinking about Pennsylvania again, while yes, Trump did flip it by tuning into local frustrations over jobs and trade, there's also a valid argument that this focus can backfire. It sometimes overshadows urgent national issues like healthcare or climate change that affect everyone, not just swing state voters. So while playing up to localized concerns does win elections, it might not always result in the best long-term policymaking for the country as a whole. That's something worth pondering, don't you think?
You know, Joe, you're hitting the nail on the head, and it does get you thinking. It's like running a race, but only focusing on one hurdle. Sure, you might clear it, but what about the rest of the track? Isn't there a risk of tripping over later because you weren't looking ahead?
Absolutely, Simon. It's all about keeping your eyes on the whole track, not just the flashy parts. Well, folks, it looks like we've got to wrap up for today. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Make sure you join us back here tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern for another round of deep dives and lively banter with Simon and me. Until then, keep pondering the big questions and stay curious. Cheers.